So I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote today, Dr. Benjamin Madley. He's an associate professor of history at the University of California and a historian of Native America, the United States, and colonialism in world history. Born in Redding, California, Dr. Madley spent much of his childhood in Carrick County, near the Oregon border, where he became interested in relations between colonizers and Indigenous peoples. He has authored or co-authored 20 journal articles and book chapters. His articles have appeared in journals ranging from the American Historical Review, California History, European History Quarterly, and the Journal of British Studies, Journal of Genocide Research, Pacific Historical Review, and the Western Historical Quarterly. Yale University Press published his first book, An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. This was published in 2016. This book received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for History, the Lemkin Book Award from the Institute for the Study of Genocide, the Charles Redd Center Phi Alpha Theta Award for the best book on the American West, the California Book Award Gold Medal for Californian, the Hayday Book Award History, and the Norman Nuremberg Award for the Historical Society of Southern California. That was a lot. It was also named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and an Indian Country Today host book, and also an Indian Country Today hot list book. A Choice Magazine Outstanding Academic Title, and a Caroline Bancroft History Prize honor book. True West Magazine named Madley the best, the best new Western author of 2016. Madley recently co-edited the Cambridge World History of Genocide, Volume 2, Genocide in the Indigenous Early Modern and Imperial Worlds, 1535 to 1914. It's forthcoming 2003, so stay tuned, with historian Ned Blackhawk, Ben Kiernan, and Reb Taylor. In 2018, he received the California Commendation Medal for the Military Department of the State of California. According to California Governor Jerry Brown, Madley corrects the record with his gripping story of what really happened, the actual genocide of a vibrant civilization, thousands of years in the making. So please help me welcome Dr. Madley.
First of all, I think some thank yous are due. I got to see the organization of this conference at a distance over the last several years, and I think we should just give a quick round of applause to the four organizers. They did a tremendous amount of work. So thank you. I also want to acknowledge that we're an Indian country, and that's maybe the most important thing. If you leave with one recollection of the time that we spent together this morning, it's to remember that wherever you go in this basin, or in this state, or in this hemisphere, from the shores of the Arctic to the tip of Patagonia, you will be on someone's ancient and ancestral homeland, almost all of it legally unceded. And that's really crucial to the project, I think, of all of us coming together, is to think about land and sovereignty. I don't think we ought to lose sight of those issues as we gather here together over the next several days. I also want to echo what Lorena said earlier. This is going to be some rugged material that we're going to traverse together over the coming days, and this paper that I'm about to deliver to you is no exception to that. If you need to take a moment to go outside and to listen to the water and get some fresh air, to say a prayer, or if you've just had enough, I invite you to do so. That's completely up to you. The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by a central fire, the celebrants moved together to ancient rhythms. The women's clamshell necklaces clicking softly against their beaded seashell dresses. Male dancers, meanwhile regaled as deer, birds, or hunters, supported the women in their heavy regalia. Meanwhile, singers raised their voices toward the stars with songs of knee dash, the feather dance. Between songs, they offered prayers of thanks, not only for the original creation of this marvelous world in which we are privileged to live, but also for its renewal in each and every moment. Finally, the celebrants stopped and they walked away arm in arm under a full moon. Nearby, they passed through round doorways into snug redwood houses. Outside, Lake Earl lapped gently at the shore. Inside, the Tongva people and their native guests from Northern California and Southern Oregon slept next to kith and kin. The celebrants were unaware that less than 7 miles away, men in Crescent City had gathered and established a new branch of California's ever-expanding killing machine. Crescent City's Coast Rangers and Klamath Mounted Rangers had been well armed by California Governor John Bigler. He had sent them crates containing 20 muskets, 95 rifles, dozens of swords and sabers, bayonets, and thousands upon thousands of rounds of ammunition. These men prepared to do one thing and one thing only: kill Indigenous people. In the pre-dawn hours of the final day of 1853, as many as 116 militiamen, accompanied by an unknown number of volunteer auxiliaries, quietly surrounded the village. They took up positions concealed in the brush, in the shadows of beholders, or behind the brows of high sand dunes. At daybreak, elders, women, children, and men emerged from those houses to begin their day. As they did so, according to one eyewitness, they were shot down as quickly as we could reload. Possessing only 3 guns, the Tongva and their guests were unable to effectively defend themselves against this pre-dawn attack. A few plunged into the nearby waters of Lake Earl, but there too they became targets. As they swam across the lake, they were shot down by sharpshooters who were concealed on the other side of that body of water. When the shooting stopped, perhaps hundreds of people lay dead and dying. Not more than 5 seemed to have survived this onslaught. The attackers, by their own account, suffered 1 casualty, a wounded man, and the state of California, based in Sacramento, paid all of these 116 militiamen for their so-called work. As you can see in this chilling graph, between 1846 and 1870, California's Native American population plummeted from perhaps 150,000 individuals to not more than 30,000 survivors. Disease, dislocation, and starvation caused many of these deaths. However, abduction, unfree labor, mass death on federal Indian reservations, homicides, and massacres took thousands of lives while simultaneously hindering biological reproduction. This was, as I will argue today, nothing less than a case of genocide. So what do I mean when I use this politically charged and explosive word that we are all going to be talking about at great length over the coming days? I don't want for the discussion of the definition to suck all of the oxygen out of the room, but I do want you to know exactly what I mean when I use this term in my work. For a prosecutor to successfully convict a defendant of the crime of genocide, they must prove 2 things beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt. First, they must prove what is known to international litigators as special intent, and that is acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. It is the highest threshold of intent that exists in international law, and crucially, this is crucial, it does not involve motive. There is no motive that comes into play in these cases. But the second thing that the prosecutor must do in order to successfully secure a conviction is to prove that the defendant has committed one of these 5 specified acts. There are other ancillary acts like inciting genocide, but these are the primary acts of genocide. Now, following the formulation of this new international legal treaty in 1948, which goes into effect in 1951, and which, by the way, is signed by almost every nation state in the world now, scholars began to reinvestigate the invasion and colonization of the state of California. And by the year 2000, more than 20 scholars, mostly historians, but some anthropologists and sociologists and scholars from other disciplines, had concluded that what took place in California during these years that I'm going to talk about today, between 1846 and 1873, did in fact constitute genocide. What I've tried to do in this project, which in its hardback version is almost 700 pages long, is to create the first comprehensive history of this catastrophe. I spent 10 years writing this book. Why all the detail when people like Russell Thornton had already written books about this topic? Because I believe this topic calls for meticulous attention because the stakes are so high, not only for scholars like us, but also for indigenous people in the state of California, and in fact, for everyone residing or even visiting in the United States. So if US citizens, or some groups of them, founded some regions of this state where we're in, California, upon deliberate attempts to physically annihilate the indigenous people of the land, scholars like myself have to reevaluate some of the foundational axioms by which we understand the making of what is now the most populous and prosperous state in the richest and most powerful country on earth. Scholars will need to reevaluate, for example, our understanding that it was accidental acts, like the spread of epidemic diseases that caused dispopulation, rather than deliberate actions like mass murder that were the leading cause of death in this massive population catastrophe. Likewise, exceptionalist interpretations of United States history lose validity as we begin to compare the genocide that took place in California with other genocides around the world at other times and places in the human experience. I hope that the careful study of genocide in California will also lead to a reevaluation of the wider indigenous population catastrophe that took place not only throughout the Americas, but in many parts of the earth. Where scholars documented genocide, it becomes necessary to reevaluate not only the roles that private individuals played, but also government employees at the municipal, county, state, and federal level, and whether or not major decision makers orchestrated, paid for, or planned such mass killings. Larger questions then tended to follow, and I think these are some of the questions we'll be grappling with together in our days ahead. What tends to catalyze genocide? Who ordered the killing? Who carried it out? Very importantly, why don't we know more about these events? What has happened in the interceding years, decades, and centuries? And very important and painful to contemplate, did democracy drive mass murder? And ultimately, what role did genocide play in the making, bless you, of modern Canada, Mexico, the United States, and the other nation states of the earth? The genocide question, as I have found in my many visits to native California peoples, is particularly urgent. My last count, there are approximately 150,000 California Indian people. And as I've met with tribal councils, culture committees, and other groups of people, there are some big questions that come up, and I'd like to share what some of those questions are. Should they press for government apologies, reparations, and control of lands where genocidal events took place? Can they effectively marshal evidence of genocide in cases involving tribal sovereignty and federal recognition? How should they commemorate the victims of mass murder while simultaneously emphasizing successful and effective accommodation, resistance, survival, and ongoing cultural and political renewal. Now, the psychological issues surrounding genocide for California Indian people are often fraught. What happens, for example, if a tribal member learns that she is the descendant both of genocide perpetrators and genocide survivors? How might tribal governments and individuals reconcile increased knowledge of the genocide that took place in California, often at the hands of US officials, with their often intense patriotism? Many tribal council chambers, or the rooms leading to them, are decorated with the portraits of citizens who have served in the US Armed Forces. Finally, and this is perhaps one of the most important questions, what role might acknowledgement of genocide have, and apology relative to genocide have, on the intergenerational and historical trauma prevalent in many California Indian communities today, and that trauma's connection to present-day physical illnesses, substance abuse, domestic violence, and the highest rate of youth suicide of any group of people in the state of California? I argue, though, that this question of genocide is a question not only for Indigenous people. It is a question for everyone in the United States. Should government officials tender public apologies, as have Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush in the 1980s for the relocation and internment of some 120,000 Japanese Americans during the Second World War, many of them California citizens and interned here in California? There's been a step toward that, as you heard in the introduction. The previous governor of the state of California has acknowledged that this was a genocide, and the current governor of the state of California has issued a public apology. But will that really matter? Will federal officials follow suit? Another question is whether or not federal officials will offer compensation along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion that Congress has paid out to the 82,210 Japanese Americans who were interned during the Second World War and to their descendants. There are also state issues. A really big one that I hear people asking me about all the time is, might California officials decrease or completely erase their cut of California Indian gaming revenues, which as of 2014 exceeded $7.3 billion. By the way, for those of you who are visitors, this cut of California Indian gaming revenues, which is a direct violation of their sovereignty, is a major funding stream for the state of California. So there's a lot of money involved in these questions. A better understanding of the genocide that took place in California might also address or change the federal government's dealings with the scores of California Indian tribal communities currently seeking federal recognition. We have 109 tribes in this state who are federally recognized. We have an additional 78 tribes who are recognized by Sacramento, but not by Washington, D.C. And then we have several dozen others who are recognized neither by Sacramento nor by Washington, D.C. And one of the things that I've found in my work after this book was published is that lawyers are constantly calling, wanting to ask about pieces of evidence having to do with their representation of unrecognized tribes. The question of commemoration is also very closely linked. Will non-native people support or even tolerate the same kinds of public monuments or public days of remembrance that we currently celebrate here in California for other genocides, for example, the Holocaust? Will genocide against California Indian peoples join these other mass murders as part of our public school curricula or part of our public discourse? It's very unusual that all of us are gathered with some knowledge about this. When I speak about this topic, most people are completely blindsided. They have zero knowledge of this. These questions are all extremely important, but they can't really be addressed without understanding the actual history of what happened here in California between 1846 and 1873. Now, sporadic mass killings of California Indian people punctuated the initial years following the US invasion of the state. But it was James Marshall's 1848 gold strike that precipitated a new wave of much more intense violence. And it was Oregon men coming south to participate in the gold rush who precipitated a dramatic increase in the number of attacks and the lethality of those attacks. In 1849, Oregonian assaults on California Indian individuals, communities, and whole nations increased further in their lethality and frequency, particularly in the central mines, which you can see mapped here, where the mines are now booming. This is a Cartesian representation, I apologize. One 49er explained in a journal account that I found, and I quote, "Oregon people had been used to shooting Indians, and in California, they did shoot them freely." That April, Theodore Johnson entered the epicenter of this local genocide, Coloma, at Sutter's Mill, where Marshall had first found gold. In the central mines, Johnson and other eyewitnesses recounted multiple massacres, scalpings, and the slaying of surrendered California Indian civilians. Due to primary spotty source coverage, there were no newspapers yet in this portion of California. We will never know the precise number of California Indian people who perished in the mines in 1849 and early 1850. But by my estimation, hundreds, if not thousands, of people may have suffered violent deaths there during these years. What was absolutely clear to observers at the time, though, was the exterminatory nature of these killings, both in their intent and in their actual impact. In December of 1849, Pomo and Wapo Indian people held as slaves on the shores of Clear Lake at this place, Kelseyville, which you can see on the map here, rose up and killed their two white American captors. Now, in response to this double homicide, the United States Army, vigilantes, and regular U.S. soldiers killed as many as 1,000 California Indian people or more just between Christmas 1849 and May 15th of 1850 in the area depicted on this map. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers of Napa and Sonoma Valley Indian people. Then, after authorities arrested 8 of these vigilantes, California's Supreme Court tried them in its very first case. And what did they do? They released all 8 men on bail, and they never went through with a formal trial. If you're not from California, you may not know this, but the legislature just voted to rename our oldest law school, which is named after this Supreme Court Chief Justice who made this initial ruling. So Hastings Law School is going to be renamed. That's the power of history, by the way. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army also sought to avenge the deaths of these 2 white slaveholders. In a San Francisco newspaper article titled "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," a journalist described a massacre committed by the United States Army on an island in Clear Lake using information provided to him directly by a regular U.S. Army captain, and I quote, "Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of but short duration. Neither age nor sex was spared. It was the order of extermination fearfully obeyed," end quote. As many as 800 Wapo and Pomo people, the majority women, children, and elders, were murdered that day. Other killings followed, and this is very important. None of the officers involved received censure. None of them were sent to prison. None of them received a demotion or a pay cut. In fact, every one of them received a promotion. In latter years, 3 of them became full U.S. Army generals. 1 of them became governor of the state of California. So a new factor was at work: large-scale extended vigilante and regular U.S. Army operations tolerated by both state and federal officials. As the California gold rush continued, newcomers continued to surge into the state like a human tidal wave. Before the gold rush, there were perhaps 13 or 14,000 non-native people in the entire state of California. As you can see from this chart, by 1860, there were more than 360,000. So this was the single largest mass migration of the 19th century in the United States. These newcomers came primarily in search of wealth. They came to get rich quick and then go home. But in seeking to access gold, eat, dress, acquire labor, and satisfy their rapacious sexual desires, immigrants placed immense pressures on indigenous communities. These demands triggered an explosion of industrial-scale ranching, hunting, mining, and slave raiding. These activities generated shockwaves that literally tore communities apart. And California's new leaders magnified that impact. Under martial law, U.S. military officers explicitly made California Indian people into second-class citizens with very few rights. California's 1849 Constitution, created and signed here at Colton Hall, a building, state park that you can still visit today in Monterey, they made it all but impossible for any Indian person to vote. And a few months later, in the very first meeting of California's brand new legislature, legislators banned all Indian people from voting, barred Indians with 1/2 of Indian blood or more from providing testimony for or against whites in criminal cases, and then banned Indian people from serving as jurors in courts of law. The following year, they banned all Indian people from serving as attorneys. So in combination, these laws largely shut California Indian people out of participation in and protection by the new state's legal system. Abduction played a major role in the California Indian population decline. In 1850, legislators passed the infamous Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. Many of you are probably familiar with this act. It legalized the white custody of Indian minors while also facilitating prisoner leasing and allowing courts to summarily reject Indian testimony in both criminal and civil cases. Native people could thus be forced into unpaid work for extended terms on trumped-up charges. 10 years later, in 1860, California legislators extended that act to allow for the indenture of any Indian or Indians. These laws triggered a boom in slave raiding. What would happen if we were a community assaulted by slave raiders in the 1850s and 1860s? They would come into this room and they would first kill all of the older men. Wolf, me, everybody else who's old. Anybody who resisted the assault would be killed. Anybody who tried to run across that courtyard and get away would be killed. People would then be trussed up like animals and thrown into wagons or have their hands tied together and led away behind horses to slave marts. Often the slave raiders already had contracts and they knew who they were going to sell human beings to. This scattering of the community would then make it very difficult for us to biologically reproduce ourselves or to maintain crucial social connections and to maintain connection to the land, because almost always people were taken far away from their place of origin so that distance served as the barbed wire, distance served as the walls that kept people in servitude. I just want to tell you what happened here in California as a result of this. Every Monday morning, there was a slave mart right down in the plaza. You can go to where it is. People would be sold. They were sold typically for a 1-week term. And one lawyer recalled, I just want to quote this, Los Angeles had its weekly slave mart, and thousands of honest, very useful people were absolutely destroyed in this way. We can see the effects by reading the census. In 1850, there were 3,693 Indian people enumerated in the town of Los Angeles, the Pueblo of Los Angeles. 10 years later, there were 219. Escape was one way that people defied these systems of servitude, but vigilantes frequently responded with overwhelming lethal force. The Lasik and Wailaki woman Lucy Young, who we see here in portrait toward the end of her life, she escaped servitude multiple times. In one case, she was chained to a cast iron wood stove, and she used the axe that was sitting there to chop her way through the chain and liberate herself. Here's her recollection. Young woman been stole by white people, come back, shot through lights and liver. Front skin hang down like apron. She tie up with cotton dress, never die, neither. Others were less fortunate. After one California woman fled her, quote, lord and master with his Indian boy in 1858, end quote, white vigilantes massacred some 15 people, her and her entire family. 2 years later, a rancher on the Van Dusen River in northwestern California became so incensed when his 7-year-old California Indian servant visited his family half a mile away that he, quote, slaughtered the entire family, 6 persons, boy and all, end quote. Despite such reports, which appear with alarming frequency in 19th century California newspapers, state and federal law enforcement officials turned a blind eye and almost never intervened. The United States Congress, meanwhile, made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to immigration's blast. In 1851 and 1852, federal agents signed 18 treaties with 119 California Indian leaders, allocating them 7,488,000 acres. So we can see the treaty areas are the dark gray zones surrounded by white. Those were the lands set aside by those treaties. But when the treaties arrived at the United States Senate, senators met in secret session and repudiated all 18 of them. Instead, Congress authorized just 5 military reservations not to exceed 25,000 acres each and conferred no legal land titles or recognition. So we're going from roughly 7.5 million acres to a maximum of 125,000 acres. The results were fourfold. First, no reservations were legally patented, and jurisdiction over these temporary reservations in California was left uncertain. Second, and this is very important, because jurisdiction had not been defined, confusion and conflict between and among state, county, and federal authorities would be the prevailing condition on reservations for decades to come. Third, California Indian people did not become the explicit federal wards of the United States government. Finally, Major General John Wool's 1857 interpretation of the reservation's legal status denied them the protection of the United States Army. I'm going to read you this order because it's so important. Until these reservations are perfected, the United States troops have no right to exclude the whites from entering and occupying the reserves, or even to prevent them from kidnapping women and children, end quote. So federal officials made California Indian people particularly vulnerable, not only to kidnapping, but also to enslavement and to outright mass murder. The establishment of California's new militia system now marked the rise of a state-sponsored killing machine. Between the years 1850 and 1861, 3,414 men voluntarily enrolled in 24 militia operations against California Indian people, killing at least 1,342 of them. We can talk a lot more about the numbers in the Q&A if you like, but that's an absolute baseline number, the absolute minimum. But their actions, the actions of these volunteer state militia operations, were much more important than just the numbers. Why? Because they served as a widely publicized, very public advertisement of federal and state policy toward California Indian people. Not only were participants not punished, they were in fact richly rewarded. And that led to a boom in vigilante killings. During the years that I'm talking about, vigilantes killed an absolute minimum of 6,401 California Indian people. In January of 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett declared, and I quote, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. This is not some hidden away comment that he made on the down low, in the dark. This is in his annual message to the Assembly and the Senate of California. So this is as public a pronouncement as he could make. The following month, state legislators then voted to borrow $500,000, a huge amount of money at this time, and by far the single largest line item in the state's budget for that year, for past and future anti-Indian volunteer state militia operations. Meanwhile, the state began building up an extensive arsenal of cutlasses, sabers, rifles, muskets, ammunition, saddles, all donated to them by the United States Army. Then in 1852, United States Senator John Weller, who became California's governor in 1858, told his fellow United States senators on the Senate floor in Washington, D.C., that California Indians, and I quote, will be exterminated. He insisted, the interest of the white man demands their extermination. That same year, having now spent the first $500,000 that they raised, state legislators voted to enact a $600,000 bond measure to pay for additional operations. What we're looking at here is one of the bonds. They came in many different denominations, 50, 100, 250, and 500, indicating to us as scholars that they were meant for a variety of different types of buyers. A small denomination bond might be bought by a private citizen. $500 bonds are probably only purchased by the very wealthy or by financial institutions. I'm now working on a project to write the history of these bonds, what banks transacted them, where do they go, and it's a national thing. I can just foreground that for you. These are not only traded as financial commodities on the Pacific Stock Exchange in San Francisco, but they also appear as far away as Boston and New York, and I suspect they're going to appear in European financial markets as well. So people are actually financing and profiting from investing in genocide. The Sinkyone woman, Sally Bell, pictured here, provided us with a rare eyewitness California Indian recollection of a massacre that took place in the 1850s. She remembered, and I quote, "About 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather, and my mother, and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister, and they cut her heart out, and they threw it into the brush where I had run to hide. My sister was just a little baby, just crawling around. I did not know what to do. I was so scared, I guess I just hid there for a long, long time with my little sister's heart in my hands." It was a terrifying time to be an indigenous person in California. The United States Congress endorsed such killing even as state and federal officials worked to perfect their killing machine. In the year 1854, the United States Congress voted overwhelmingly to allocate more than $924,000 to be paid into the California State Treasury to reimburse the state for its past volunteer militia operations. The following year, this man, State Quartermaster and Adjutant General William C. Kibbe, who ran California's militia system from 1853 through the end of 1863, underscored this state's genocidal militia purpose. There are but two alternatives before us, he said, either to wage a war of extermination or to abandon a large and productive territory. Land was central to the California genocide. To help perfect his killing machine, Kibbe wrote a tactical manual, had it published, and then distributed it to all of his state militia officers. Meanwhile, then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who would go on to be the leader of the rebelling Confederate States, sent Kibbe U.S. Army tactical manuals to distribute to his militiamen as Christmas gifts. Then in 1857, having already spent $1.1 million on hunting Indian people, state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for additional militia operations with predictable results. Finally, in 1861, Congress appropriated another $400,000 to reimburse California for all of those expenses. Civilians also carried out large forced removal operations to concentrate California Indian people on federal Indian reservations, and those operations were often extremely violent. In one case in Mendocino County, when a group of people resisted, 50 of them were shot dead. The Lake Yakuts woman Yoy Mut from California's central San Joaquin Valley recollected that during the forced removal of her relatives to the Fresno Reservation, soldiers first shot 12 people and then killed a dozen who could not keep up during the march. Likewise, the Nome Lackey man Andrew Freeman explained, when they took the Indians to the Round Valley Reservation, they drove them like stock, and they would shoot the little children who could not make the trip and were getting tired. Once at reservations, California Indian people often faced institutionalized malnutrition and outright starvation. The Concow leader Tamayanem recollected that after volunteers had forcibly removed his people to the Mendocino Reservation, we were very hungry and the Concows began to die very fast. Other reservations proved little better. In 1860, he removed his people south to the Round Valley Reservation, hoping to find food there, but he recollected there was even less to eat. Indeed, in 1860, officials there typically provided just 480 to 910 calories per day to working Round Valley Reservation inmates. By 1862, after the federal government cut funding for reservations in California, rations there fell to just 160 to 310 calories per working person per day. Some reservation colonists also treated reservation Indians as unpaid laborers with lethal results. According to one man testifying under oath, and I quote, about 300 died on the Round Valley Reservation during the winter of 1857 to 1858 from the effects of packing them through the mountains in the snow or mud. They were worked naked and carried 50 pounds each, if able. So at California reservations, willful neglect took an untold number of Indian lives. But the federal government soon took over the killing. During the U.S. Civil War, federal officers and their men killed thousands of California Indian people. They transformed the killing machine. It became a purely federal project. The California Indian Catastrophe fits the two-part definition set forth in the UN Genocide Convention. First, perpetrators demonstrated both in word and in deed their intent to destroy. And they committed not one, but all of these 5 genocidal acts enumerated here. Killing took place in more than 370 known massacres and scores of homicides. Sources indicate that between 1846 and 1873, vigilantes, militiamen, and regular U.S. soldiers killed at least 9,492 to 16,094 California Indian people, and probably many, many, many more. By way of contrast, they killed fewer than 1,300 non-Indian people during these years. But other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings occurred, and these meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their group identity and with the intent to destroy the group. The sustained military and civilian policy of demolishing villages and chasing survivors into inhospitable desert and mountain regions also amounted to deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Some Office of Indian Affairs employees, likewise administering federal reservations, were guilty of the same crime. Further, and this is often lost in genocide studies, but because malnutrition and exposure predictably lowered fecundity and increased stillbirths and miscarriages, some state and federal decision makers also appear to have been guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, the state, professional slave raiders, and federal officials were all very much involved in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. 3,000 to 4,000 California Indian children suffered such forced transfer during these years. By breaking up families and shattering entire communities, forced removals also constituted imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Sufficient evidence thus exists to designate the California Indian Catastrophe a case of genocide according to international law. Thank you. Mishana, do you want to come up to take questions also? No? How will we do that, though? Okay. Okay. Well, I think people have questions for you.
Thanks. I'll go quickly. I was interested in what you said about the bond, and I'm wondering if you could just comment about today's stock exchange and how much corporations and companies are contributing to ongoing genocide through removals and polluting of indigenous lands.
Well, I'm a historian, so we were very bad at talking about the present. But I will say that we can see a deep and enduring pattern that goes back hundreds of years before the events I was speaking about, that goes back to the very arrival of Columbus in the islands, that immediately there is, financing. Other people's land was stolen to finance that expedition, Jewish land. And then right away, it's a corporate venture. I was just reading through this is why it's front of my mind. I was just reading through his journal of the first voyage. He mentions gold 137 times. I started counting. And then in his letters back to Isabella and Ferdinand, he mentions gold another 7 times. And in one of the letters, he says, gold can do everything. It can even send souls to heaven. Mm-hmm. So the colonial project, the catastrophes of colonialism, are very much rooted in greed and in corporate structures that begin in the late 15th century. So what I was speaking about, I think, is nothing new. It's all part of a long trajectory that goes back to the beginning.
So one of the things that I didn't get to is the fact that making land into property, it was essential. So in 1850, or when you were talking, Ben, about the 1850-51 period, that's when land was being transitioned to the Public Claims Commission into title, so that that title could be held. And there was all kinds of other, part of the killing was because of wanting to create that land into title under U.S., what I call domesticating land, right? Which I thought everybody knew what that was, but I got asked that question the other day, what does that mean? But that domestication comes because of the way title and property are also heteropatriarchal in that way, right? That property law is passed to land ownership, which is foundational to the U.S. From the very first census, it was white property-owning men. So this gets carried into the case in California in that 1850-51 era. Now, what happens also there is that there are numerous people in Los Angeles that also were involved in Canada, in the killings in Canada with the Louis Riebel rebellion, and got land title that they made into a financial, and then came here. That's how Arthur Letts establishes West Los Angeles, where UCLA is at, which eventually becomes the Playboy Mansion. So there becomes a whole way that title gets passed and broken down in relation to that, which is part of that same moment that Ben
Yeah,
so
let me-
thoroughly discusses.
Connecting to what Mishana is saying, when on the very day that California becomes a state, Fremont, who's one of the first two senators representing California, he comes with a whole raft of 13 bills that he wants to bring before the Senate that are all about land. And one of the crucial ones is he wants to extinguish Indian title. So you can see how embedded it is in the very foundational moment, the very day California becomes a state. What do the federal senators from California do? They want to extinguish Indian title. They want to grab a bunch of land to create the UC system. That's the beginning of the land theft that, they pay us. So we're paid partly from that. And they also want to make sure that they get rid of any claims that the existing Mexican landholders have too. So you can't really talk about this without making land a central point of discussion. And the land is all about profit, for the invaders.
And just to bring it up to the present, and then Stanley has a question, I think, that in the present, what manifested after that were oil well refineries and these sorts of things, where LA becomes a center also of that kind of environmental destruction. The industries of ceramic industries for the airline, which then eventually will bring those from the Pacific after post-World War II into these territories. Oil wells, then you get like a large, that's why we have also, there becomes a mass exodus during the Dust Bowl and further development of that. And there are some wonderful maps that kind of document where the oil well refineries are still working today, and they're largely in those communities of color in Los Angeles where that is happening. And there's a woman up at Occidental or one of the Claremont colleges that is mapped out all the pollution areas that relate to those oil refineries as those titles pass. So that answers that kind of environmental question. But the environmental destruction is part of the process of what Ben is talking about. But I think Stanley had a question.
Boy, I just don't even know where to start. But I'll just start with the Doctrine of Discovery and how those documents, laid the framework for the genocide to take place in the Americas, not just in the Americas, but in Asia, Africa, all over the world. And we see it in Australia today. We see it all over. But back to California, when we talk about, we as Native people in California, we've endured 3 waves of encroachment: Spanish, Mexican, and American. The American wave, when they came in, taking a look at the history, why did they do it? It's because Texas wanted to, join the Union, and they were a slave state. That would have created an imbalance. So the United States needed to take California so they would have a balance between slave and free states, allegedly. That's one of the reasons why they took it. And you're right. The native population in California was the majority. Non-natives were a small minority, but then when encroachment came in, all the people, all these people coming in to the gold fields, that started another wave a wave of genocide, and and not to talk about just what happened with the Jewish people or the Roma people, but whole nations up north were just eradicated. All their people are gone. So as they continue doing this, you were talking about the 18 treaties. These 18 treaties that were made, I'll just say for our people, the Kumeyaay people, the Treaty of San Isabel, which was created on January 7th, 1852, promised us a reservation from the Mexican border all the way to up to Riverside County. These were the 18 treaties that were never ratified, and this was due in part because this was on the eve of the Civil War. A lot of people were rushing in, non-native people seeing that as good land, and they basically petitioned the government that they would side with the Confederacy if those treaties were ratified. And again, all this land was taken away. And in the Doctrine of Discovery, it states that natives are not allowed to own land. They can reside on land, and that document is still used as one of the founding documents that the Supreme Court uses in its cases to this day. So all these things that were taking place with our native people, and even when the reservations were created, and here in California there are no state identified tribal groups, only federally recognized, no state recognized. I thought there were state, and I found out later that there are none, no state recognized groups. They have no protection at all. But even with the federally recognized groups, it was all created by executive order. And what does that mean when we talk about executive order? No treaties were created. That land can be taken back at any time. So these are some of the problems that we've had in California. And last thing I want to say before I shut my snoot is California has more language and cultural diversity than any other part of the world aside from Papua New Guinea. And for these, acts to take place, it was like libraries of knowledge and culture that have been burnt to the ground to never be able to reclaim again. And that is a tragedy. So I just want to share that. Thank you.
Yahweh.
So we have a limited amount of time remaining for questions. If it's okay with the presenters, we'll take a few, collect them, and then hopefully you can address them briefly. So.
Hello, thank you, Ben, for your lecture. I wanted to ask you about the figures, the numbers that you brought up, and the registers that you use, because we find a lot of similarities in the Argentinian case, but we don't have that amount of numbers.
Yeah. Okay. So if you really want to see all of the numbers, there are a couple of ways to access this data. One is to get a hold of the hardback copy of the book. The appendices are about 200 pages long, and they list all of the financial information, all of the killings, divided up into different scales, and there's a whole section on disputed massacre death tolls for some of the big massacres. But I thought this was pretty important to get out into the public, so I did a project with California State Parks that started under the previous governor, and it's called the California Native American Digital Atlas. So what's quite useful for scholars about this is you can look things up by region, by tribal identity if we know it, and then you can actually see the sources that I used. We got a big grant to have graduate students at UC Berkeley scan everything. And so you can actually click on these hyperlinks. So if you're looking at, say, the Bloody Island Massacre in 1850 of Pomo and Wapo people in what is now Lake County, you can actually click on all of the accounts and you will be able to read them for yourself. So this seemed like best practice. I learned a lot of this from Lyndall Ryan when she began her mapping of the massacres in Australia to try to think through making it as public and as accessible as possible. So maybe to get to the core of what you're asking, because I know you're asking about the sources, but you could look at this. A lot of it is very public. A lot of it is newspaper accounts, but it's also from private journals and letters. It's from the official records of the state militias themselves. It's from the official records of the United States Army. But the biggest source by far is newspapers. And so you would have multiple different accounts published in the newspapers, and they would then be circulated and republished. So that account that I read you about a horrible slaughter of Indians, this didn't just appear in the Daily Alta California, which was California's most widely circulated newspaper. It was then republished in dozens of other newspapers. So we didn't catalog all of that, but I think this wasn't a secret dirty war. This was a very public operation, and a lot of people were making a lot of money. And all of those bills to gather more funding or to recognize a group of vigilantes as militiamen were all public. So there's records of all of that. And there had to be votes. And so there had to be an accretion of political support for those things to happen. And while there were people who stood up against the genocide, by and large, most non-native people voted for this money to be spent, voted for these weapons to be given away at both the state and the federal level.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and hopefully during the break that's going to follow, we can continue this conversation.
Good morning, Ben and Rashana. Thank you so much for your talks. It's really good to see you. I'm right here. Hi. Hi, Rashana. I was noticing, of course, your evidence, Ben, especially we're both historians, and historians like to push our evidence to the fore. But I saw the sort of silent or whispered critique of Edward Curtis in your evidence, and I was hoping that we could sort of yell our critique of Curtis. But also, because he's still being used, right? The Palm Springs Art Museum did an exhibit maybe 2 or 3 years ago, with all these amazing California Indian artists like Gerald Clark, but then there's Edward Curtis, right there. So it's not like our critique has been loud enough of Curtis. So let us do it again. And then second, you're talking about the 19th century, and then you've got these amazing images, of these people from tribes who are the survivors, and they're the ones that are telling us about who did not survive. So maybe we could do both of those things with our Edward Curtis moment.
Yeah. So one thing, if you read my book, the first time that I show an Edward Curtis image, there's quite lengthy, like a mini essay underneath it about it. And coming out of grad school, I was very anti-Curtis. I'd heard lots of critiques. But then when I went back home to California and was visiting with people and doing my interviews, and my mode was to gather a lot of research, write a presentation, and then go to a tribal community meeting place and show it, and then get lots of feedback. And it was usually a phased process, first just with council, then with the culture council, and then sometimes with everybody. And one of the things that I learned going into people's houses is, certainly in Northern California and in a lot of Southern California, there are Curtis photos in people's living rooms and in their kitchens. And they're also in public tribal spaces. So that's what I tried to write about. But I also heard from people about what happened when that photo of their great-great auntie was taken. And he would say, okay, take your watch off. Okay, take your diamond wedding ring off. Let's get the car out of the background. But I want to speak to the broader question of, because this is, what you do too, and I do a little bit, representation of people, representation of humans. I think we always should be telling our readers that it's through the lens of whoever made that image. And so we could say this about Curtis, we could say this about Caitlin, any of the people who have done the large collections of depictions of humans who are not their group, they've modified it and they've twisted it. Okay, to the second part, I had to make a decision at a certain point. Was I going to try to use all these interviews that I had gathered, and was I going to do a 2-volume book? And I decided that one 700-page book was enough, and I had to cut hundreds of pages to get down to that size. 700 pages is the largest that Yale University Press can bind. You can't go more than 700 pages. So that became the defining feature. That was the rule that kept me at that limit. But what I would say to everyone, and maybe there are people who want to write this book, we need a companion to the book that I wrote that is purely based on interviews with people today. Because there's a whole different story that would be centered in indigenous knowledge, California Indian perspectives, and it would probably be revelatory because it would change the way we see this. So we need that.
I would say, just on that last point, there's a lot of California Indian scholars now. They have a consortium, and I fully want to just say that here, because there are people that are examining these issues, like Mark Minch out of UCR. A lot of my grad students, ex-grad students, or not graduate, they're not ex, they're just graduated. Katie Kiala's doing a lot of really important work. I'm reading Stephanie Lumsden's dissertation continually lately, who's working on incarceration and this moment in Hoopa Valley area. So there are several California Indian scholars that are starting to take on this work and doing that, and they need full support and awareness, and they need the institutions in California to hire them and to support them and to do that work. That's part of the accountability that needs to take place at USC, private, public, and all the universities as well. And we have a job search, if any California Indians are listening, at UCLA right now, and we have an emphasis on trying to hire. We're finally going to be a department after many years so that we can hire that person, because this is interdisciplinary work. And I'll get to that to answer the other part of the question and go back, is how anthropology played a role in all of this as well, with J.P. Harrington and other anthropologists who would take photos and such. It's not just Edward Curtis. We put a lot of emphasis on Edward Curtis. But I think about Jean Lamar's artwork and contemporary artwork, and what she looks at the way these photos circulated of young women who were, you know, we all know what happened. You didn't talk about sexual violence as much. It was in your talk. But we all know that's why young women sold for higher rates at La Plaza and in other places. And so that was part of that. But these circulations of photos, I love Jean Lamar's work for what contemporary Native artists do. She took one of the soldiers, the photography soldiers, Sewell, had this circulation of this young woman that we see a lot, actually represented as California, but she reclothes her in the lavender and cares and puts her back in traditional dress and repatriates her through that art. And that's the care that Native artists are doing, California Indian artists are doing, but also all over in our communities are doing with those kind of archives like Curtis. I had similar experiences as you with Curtis. Whenever I teach it in my classroom, people, well, this is at Dartmouth and Stanford, people be, oh, that's my great-grandmother. So people have a vexed feeling with that, right? Or we all want that kind of, you know, the pictures to see our ancestors. And that's fine, but we also have to address the kind of violence there. You know, he was supported by J.P. Morgan, so again, it gets back to how corporations circulated in that particular way. But I think, you know, I highly suggest, if you want to understand also how Will Wilson plays a role, how Curtis plays a role, look at Will Wilson, who's a Navajo photographer, a contemporary Navajo photographer, who examines the process that he used, because I think it also helps us understand, like, I look totally different by using that same plate method. So he has this thing called the photographic exchange, because he's looking at the different ways that community can exchange with the Curtis photos. And so he kind of does that. He went around in a tent and used the same plate method, and it totally changed the way I teach Curtis, because I see, like, you have to sit so still and you can't move. We weren't stoic people. We laughed. We had joy. We still laugh and have joy most of the time. But, you know, you have to sit so still in those frames, right? So how did that also create understandings of who we are through those photographs? So I think there's also becomes part of thinking through that process. But Will Wilson, Jean Lamar, think about that archive. Think about what contemporary Native artists are doing. So that's what I say.
I just want to thank Dr. Madley for and congratulate you for the fabulous research that you've done. You know, I can't even imagine how many hours and months and years, well, you said 10 years, right, of your life. So important. And I'm very grateful that you were here to come and share that history. I'm sure a lot of us have a number of things that we would like to do now with that history. You mentioned recording elders and other people that have been impacted by that history. And I see a lot of interdisciplinary work that could be done in supporting that. So again, thank you very much. And we will now take a brief 10-minute break to grab some tea or coffee, go get some sunshine or fresh air if you need to, and we'll see you back here soon.